Today we'll be dealing with commercialization of agriculture in India under British colonial rule. We propose to divide our discussion into some sections. First is the introduction, followed by commercialization of agriculture, and here we will deal with four different regions: North and Central India, then Western India, then Eastern India, and after that we have South India. And after that, in the next section, we will deal with the beneficiaries of the commercialization of agriculture. Who were the actual beneficiaries? Were they the Indian people, the basic masses, or the British capitalists and their collaborators? And in the last section, we will make a brief summing up. So we begin with the first one, that is the introductory part. Now, in fact, the establishment of colonial rule in our country brought about fundamental changes in Indian society. Indian society was feudal in the earlier period. Now, after the advent of colonial rule, establishment of colonial rule, it became colonial and semi-feudal in character. And agriculture was the field where the colonial rulers, ruling classes, first devoted their main attention. And we have already pointed out that three important land settlements were made in three different regions of the country: the permanent settlement in Eastern India, the Raitwari settlement in South India, and a Mahalwari settlement in northwestern or parts of central India. And the main aim of all these land revenue settlements was to establish colonial rule on a stable foundation, so that there would be more revenue earning, and there would be, of course, a landed elite class which would serve as one of the main props of colonial rule. Now, commercialization of agriculture was another important outcome, which also was part and parcel of the same process of consolidation of colonial rule. And in fact, its main purpose was to convert Indian agriculture into a raw material supplying appendage to metropolitan Britain. Commercialization of agriculture normally means production of agricultural commodities and their sale for cash. Now, that is clear meaning of the term commercialization. But production of this type, commodity production of this type, existed in our society in the pre-British trace. There was nothing new in it, in this particular thing. And in fact, it did not signify any institutional change. Now, when British colonial rule was established, the commercialization of agriculture assumed a broader meaning. It's a new meaning, and it meant the participation of the peasants in the market process, development of a land market, development of also an output market, and the consequent differentiation of the peasantry. Now, that was something entirely new, features which were not there in the pre-British period, in the period before the colonial rule was established. And all these features, this participation in the land market, in the agricultural market, the development of a land market, output market, etc., and this differentiation. Now, all these are integral parts of the capitalist system. Now, it has been pointed out by K. Bharadwaj that commercialization in output markets was stimulated by external factors also. Of course, one very important external factor was the presence of colonial rule. That is the most important one, no doubt about it. And along with it, there were transport links, a transport network, which of course came with the railways, particularly with the development of the railway system at a later period. Then we have India became part and parcel of a global market since she became a colony. So she no longer remained more or less isolated from the world outside. It became part of a global network because of the fact that British Empire was the only world empire at that stage. And so it became part and parcel of a number of forces which were not there in the days before colonial rule intervened in our society. As a matter of fact, in the first half of the 19th century, as Marx pointed out, a new and international division of labor arose. And India was forcibly converted into a country which produced raw materials such as cotton, indigo, opium, tea, etc., and many other things, some directly for British industries. And this brought about the destruction of the old union between agriculture and handicrafts, complete colonization of Indian economy, and the conversion of the Indian economy into an appendage of the metropolitan economy. One can, in this connection, also refer to Marx's concept of the Asiatic mode of production. Of course, this concept was Marx's earlier concept, and he, of course, revised that concept at a later period of time. Let us now take up the different regions one after the other. We begin with the north and central India. That is the northwestern side, Punjab side, where we have the Mahalwari settlement. Mahalwari settlement was introduced there. Now, in the backward regions of the Punjab, such as the western part, the southeastern part, the peasants were drawn into the whirlpool of commerce by a number of factors. One, of course, was excessive revenue and rent. Then there was insecurity of harvest owing to low rainfall, natural reason. Then lack of fertility of the soil. Then lesser irrigational facility. These were some of the factors which forced the peasants into the field for the production of cash crops or commercial crops. And there was the combination of trade and usury, which naturally forced them to take advances. So the Dadun system developed as a result. And it was very strong in those areas, in the western side or southeastern side of the Punjab region. The situation, however, was a bit different in central Punjab and the canal colonies. Canal colonies were those colonies where new areas where British settled people who were very much tied up with them, pro-British people, through canals. And these regions came to be known as the canal colonies. That is in the second half of the 19th century, after the revolt of 1857, of course. And in fact, irrigational facility was available, which ensured greater production of cotton, greater production of sugarcane, and some other changes had also been taking place in the international scene, international field, and we have the opening of the Suez Canal, and then we have the expansion of the railways, the setting up of the introduction of the railway system from the mid-19th century, particularly after the revolt of 1857. And it was the expansion of the railways and also the opening of the Suez Canal, both of which facilitated the export of both food as also non-food crops. And in the fertile tracts of the Punjab, the credit market generally was dominated by agriculturist moneylenders, mortgagee, who did not have much interest in trading. They were moneylenders. They lent money, gave daduns lent money to the peasants to pay their revenues, and they lent it against their homes, which were mortgaged, which had to be mortgaged to them before the peasants could take advances, take money from these moneylenders and others. And this section concentrated only on mortgage debt. This section, they were not generally traders, but one section, they totally were confined to this mortgage trade. It has been pointed out by M.L. Darling that in most parts of the province, agricultural moneylenders were common. Most of the areas one can see these moneylenders and others. And when the peasants failed to pay off their debt to the moneylenders, they had to part with their land, their own plots of land, to this new class. So they became landless, totally landless. And what is true of the Punjab area region is also true of Bengal. In Bengal too, we have from then on we have the rise of the Joddar Mahajans, and it was more or less a similar pattern. And what we find is that there was thus a large-scale alienation of the peasantry from the land, vast alienation. They were impoverished, they were deprived of the land, they had to part with their land because they had taken advances, they had taken money, borrowed money, could not repay it, and it was very difficult to repay money. And so they had to part with their land, they lost their land. And in fact, there are some available data for the alienation of peasant holdings in some districts of Bihar between 1885 and 1895. And these show that in about 80% cases of alienation, mostly by the mortgage, the alienees were riots. And in Punjab, agriculturist moneylenders were by 1929 responsible for 75% of the mortgage debt of the province, as they marketed the major portion of the agricultural surplus. So it was a newly emerging money lending class, feudal class. They were not capitalists. And they exploited them. They coerced them. They were the newly rising class in whose hands were concentrated sufficient amount of money, and they acted as collaborators of the foreign rulers, of the colonial rulers. Now we pass on to the case study of Western India. Commercialization got an impetus here in the 1860s when there was the American Civil War. Now, at the time of the Civil War in America, raw cotton exports into Britain from USA stopped because of disturbances, because of many other things. And as a consequence, there was a huge deficit of raw cotton in the British market. So Britain then had to look towards India. They also looked towards China, but they also looked towards India. And the most suitable area for cotton production, of course, was the Bombay Deccan region. And side by side, as we have pointed out, there was expansion of the railway network, which connected most parts of the country. First, to begin with, the major cities and towns, port cities, and then the interior and other areas. And it was so the development of the railways, the development of the irrigational networks facilitated cash cropping and exports. Sugarcane in the Deccan and Gujarat, tobacco in Gujarat, groundnuts in Satara, cotton in Gujarat and the Deccan, all these were cash crops. Peter Harnett, another scholar, has shown that owing to rise in demand, cotton prices rose by 132% between 1860-61 and 1869-70. And the acreage under cotton increased by 97%. So cotton was a very important export item, a very important cash crop, because there was a heavy demand for cotton in the European market, in Britain herself. One Japanese scholar, Fukazawa, he said that the great expansion in internal and foreign trade had given the village moneylender more freedom of action, more freedom to maneuver. and it means that sale value of land increased when we have more and more demand for cash crops. So land became a very important commodity, alienable property, saleable commodity. It became saleable after the permanent settlement, land settlements. So it increased, and whenever there was any non-repayment of debt, so for the recovery of the debt, the court, justice, the judicial system, they enforced transfer of land from one hand to another. And in most cases, it was the peasants who suffered. In Eastern India, we have the permanent settlement. So land revenue was fixed in perpetuity. And the Jamindars, who became the new owners of land, legal owners of land, which was conditional upon their payment of land revenue on time within the stipulated date. Now, they, by virtue of their powers provided by the acts of 1799, 1812 and 1819, they enhanced their rents. They had their own rents. They enhanced their rents. And by the middle of the 19th century, the company government had been able to suppress another thing, and that was there was an enormous variation of the coinage system. We have the cowrie system. Cowrie system was very much there. Seashell. Now that was replaced by silver or gold. Exchange, medium of exchange. So gold and silver, these coins became the medium exchange rather than the cowries. And when more and more silver coins, gold coins were available in the market, there was a growth of the money market. With the circulation of money, there was a growth of the money market. And through a series of networks of credit, this universally accepted medium it extended to other regions also. It became the general feature. Gradually, it became the general feature. And the question of payment of an increase in rent was to be appreciated against the perspective of a uniform coinage system also. There should be this, the British also did. So a uniform coinage system came. You'll have to that was to be accepted as a sole medium of exchange in course of time. Now, according to an estimate between 1793 and 1880, the amount of rent increased from 120% to 180% in several districts of Bengal. And naturally, the peasants, the small peasants, would always be anxious to pay the land revenue because if they can't pay the land revenue, then you will have to part with the land. So, in their eagerness to pay their rent on time, to revenue on time, they borrowed money. They had to borrow money, and again that could not be repaid in many cases. So they were forced to part with their land. And again, the case of land alienation, it is very much there. Now, it has been observed by C. Grant that in order to cultivate his land, the peasant sought the assistance of moneylenders, the agricultural moneylenders, and in fact he mortgaged the crop before actually it was sown. Crop was mortgaged before it was actually sown. And it has been pointed out by another scholar, Amit Bhaduri, that the indebtedness of the cultivators was so vast that there was hardly a distinction between a subsistence crop and a commercial crop. Subsistence crop like rice and a commercial crop like jute. Otherwise, this distinction is very much essential, whether to determine the extent of commercialization of agriculture. But the distinction is being blurred because of the indebtedness of the cultivators and the choice of the crop. What crop would be chosen for cultivation? That was to be decided again by the moneylenders, by the merchants and others.
Sir, my question is, what were the differences between the moneylenders of this age and the moneylenders of the past?
Yes, moneylenders were there in ancient India also. One can talk about the Shreshtin, when there was the emergence of Mogul, there was the emergence of universal monarchies. Moneylenders were there, Shrestins were there, merchants were there. Now, but the moneylenders of those times, of course, they were different from the moneylenders of in colonial India. When we talk about the colonial India, moneylenders were very much part and parcel of another historical process, socio-economic process. These moneylenders, many of them emerged in the new colonial situation, and they were integral parts of the colonial machinery of tribute extraction, revenue extraction. In fact, there were a large number of intermediaries. It was they who helped the peasants, in fact the jamindars also, to pay their land revenue to the state. So they were part of the same process, and they were part and parcel of the state, domestic collaborators, who benefited from colonial rule. So this was something different, different from the old situation.
Sir, why was railway introduced in India?
Railways were introduced in India for a number of reasons. One, of course, was the political reason, the necessity for politically unifying the whole of India. It was the British who first united all India politically. The other was a military reason, that is, particularly during the revolt of 1857. It was very difficult for the British government to send troops to suppress mutiny, to suppress rebellions in many parts. And so they felt the necessity to establish transportation, communication network, farm communication network, so that there would be steady and quick, swift movement of troops from one place to another. And there was another reason, third reason, and that is first you extract raw material, send the raw material to the port cities for the shipment abroad, and then when foreign products would come to the ports, and then in order to sell them in the interior, so goods had to be shifted from the port cities to the interior. So railways were also needed for that. So it was these reasons, the political reason, the military reason, and also this economic reason. These were some of the reasons, important reasons, which influenced the colonial government to introduce the railways in India.